Would you like to learn about the tenses in German? Then you have come to the right place, because in this course we will cover all of the German tenses with a lot of fun in the process. Hi, my name is Luca and I'm a language teacher from Germany. In this course we will not only take a look at the German past, present and future tenses, I will also give you some examples and exercises on how you can form sentences in these tenses on your own. My personal goal is that by the end of this course, you will know exactly when to use which tense and also how each individual tense is formed. Are you ready to jump right into it? Then let's go! Willkommen, welcome! Hi, my name is Luca and in this course we will take a look at the tenses in German. The German language and the tenses in German are often perceived as something that is very hard to learn and pretty difficult. What I want to show you in this course is that there is nothing to be afraid of. The tenses in German are pretty logical and actually they are even a little easier than in English. To see what I mean by that, let's take a look at the three tenses that every language needs to have. They are the past, present and future. Every language needs to include at least one present form, one past form and one future form. One present form to be able to talk about what's happening right now in this moment. One past form to talk about things that happened in the past. For example, an event that took place a few months ago, a few years ago, or only a few seconds ago. And a future tense to talk about plans or things that can happen in the future or will happen in the future. So that's the bare minimum. One present tense, present in German is also called Gegenwart, by the way. One past tense, past is also called Vergangenheit in German. And one future tense, in German Zukunft. However, most languages have more than these three tenses. English, for example, has 6 past tenses, 2 present tenses and 4 future tenses. That's a lot more than just 3. In fact, that's a total of 12 tenses. Now, why did I say that German is easier when it comes to tenses? Let's take a look. In contrast to English, German only has 3 past tenses, 1 present tense and 2 future tenses. That's a total of only 6 tenses. So only half of the number of the English tenses. And it gets even better. Of the 2 future forms, there is one that we use in 99% of all cases. So the other one is almost never used. So you could even reduce the number of tenses to 5. And if we take a look at the past tenses in German, there's one tense, which is called perfect, which at least in spoken language we use almost all the time. So if you take a look at spoken language, in German it's almost the case that we only have one past tense, one present tense and one future tense. And as we just learned, that's the bare minimum. It can't get any easier than that. When it comes to written language, however, the 2 other past tenses also get important. So you see, the amount of tenses that you'll need to learn in German is actually very small, especially compared to English. And another good thing is that these tenses share many similarities with their English counterparts. So you see, there's really nothing to be afraid of. Now that you know how easy it is, let's take the next step and learn the German tenses together. In our first lesson, we will start with a little overview. Bis gleich, see you soon. Before we start getting into each individual tense in German and how they are formed and when we use them, I first want to give you a brief overview over which tenses there are and where there are similarities and differences to English. So as you know from our intro video, the bare minimum of all tenses that every language needs to have are past, present and future. In every language it needs to be possible to talk about the present, to talk about past events and to talk about future events. This is the bare minimum, at least 3 tenses, but most languages have more than just 3 tenses. English even has 12. In English, we have 2 present tenses, the simple present and the present progressive, 6 past tenses, the simple past, present perfect, past perfect and their progressive forms, and 4 future tenses, the will future, going to future, future progressive and future perfect. Now, German is different. It's actually easier because we only have half of the amounts of tenses that you have in English. We have 6. One present tense that is called Präsens, present, Präsens. 3 past tenses, the Präteritum, Perfekt and Plusquamperfekt, which are basically our versions of the simple past, present perfect and past perfect, and we have 2 future forms, Futur 1, future 1, and Futur 2, future 2. So far so easy, but what's actually the difference? The difference is that in German we don't have progressive forms. So for example, our Präteritum comes pretty close to your simple past, but we use it in both the situations where you would use the simple past and where you would use the simple past progressive. And the same is true for all of the other cases. For example, if you take the present, English has both the simple present and the present progressive, so a simple form and a progressive form. German, however, doesn't have this distinction. So in German, in both cases, we would use the Präsens. So it doesn't matter if you want to say, I go there or I am going there. In German, in both cases, it would be ich gehe dahin. Now, for now, it doesn't matter how these tenses are formed. It's just important that you know that in German we don't have any progressive forms, and that's why we can cut the number of tenses in English in half and we get the amount of tenses that we have in German. English has 12 tenses and German only has 6. That's good news, isn't it? It gets even better. Remember, in the intro video I told you that basically in spoken language we only use one past form, the perfect. The perfect is our equivalent to the present perfect in English, and while its usage used to be the same as in English, over the past century it turned out to be the past form in spoken language. So if you're talking about the past to a friend, you are very, very, very likely to use the present perfect, the perfect. However, this doesn't mean that the other two, the Präteritum and the Plusquamperfekt, are not important. They're just not that important for spoken language. In written language, we still use them, and that's why in this course we're going to take a look at all 3 of them. The same also goes for the future forms. Here we have Futur 1, future 1, and Futur 2. Futur 1 is basically the same as the will future and going to future in English, and it's the future tense in German. We pretty much use it all the time when we talk about the future. We sometimes also use the Präsens to do that, but that's a topic for another lesson. Our other future form, the Futur 2, is our form of the future perfect. So sentences like I will have done this, she will have eaten that, and so on. So as you can see from these example sentences, nobody really uses it. Neither in English nor in German. So out of all the 6 tenses that we have in German, the Futur 2 is the least used one. We will still take a brief look at it in this course, but the Futur 1 is much, much more important. So, to wrap this whole thing up, remember, in German we don't have any progressive forms. That's why German only needs half of the tenses that English does. We only have 6 tenses instead of 12. And of these 6 tenses we have 1 present tense, 3 past tenses and 2 future tenses. Now, of the 3 past tenses, there's 1 tense, the perfect, which is used in most past cases, and of the 2 future tenses, there's 1 tense, the Futur 1, that is used in almost all cases when we talk about the future. So while all of these tenses are pretty important, the tenses that you should focus most on are the perfect, the Präsens, and the Futur 1. But we'll still take a look at all of them. And you see, we've got a lot to do, so let's go! So let's start with our first tense. The most used tense in German, the Präsens, our present tense. How is this tense formed and when do we use it? That's what you're gonna learn in our next video. Bis gleich, see you soon. Let's start with our most used tense in German, the Präsens or present. Just as the name indicates, this tense is used to talk about the present. And unlike English, where we have 2 present tenses, in German we have only 1. And that's the one we're gonna learn now. So how do we form sentences in the present in English? Some example sentence could be, for example, I go to school, he studies German, they are watching a movie, and so on. The first 2 sentences, I go to school and he studies German, are in a tense that is called the simple present. The simple present is formed by taking the root of the verb and, in the case of he, she, and it, adding an s. In the sentence I go to school, go is just the root of the verb to go. And in he studies English, the root of to study is study, and because the sentence is in the 3rd person singular, so he, she, or it, we add an s. He studies. And you will see in a few seconds that the German Präsens is not too far away from that. The other example sentence that we have here, they are watching a movie, uses the present progressive. So as we already learned, in German we don't have any progressive tenses. Therefore, in German this sentence would also be translated with the presens. So with this one tense that is pretty close to the simple present in English. Let's take a look at the translations of the three sentences. I go to school in German would be translated with Ich gehe zur Schule. Ich gehe zur Schule. He studies German would be translated with lernt Deutsch. Lernt Deutsch. And they are watching a movie would be translated with Sie schauen einen Film. What's interesting for us now is the verb form. Because in all of these sentences, the verb form is the present tense or presens of the corresponding verb. If we take the first sentence, for example, Ich gehe zur Schule, I go to school, we have gehe. That's the first person singular of the verb gehen, to go. Gehen. Gehen is a so-called infinitive, like to go. The normal form of a verb. What we now need is the root of the verb. Remember, in English we get the root by leaving out the to. So the root of to go is go. In German we leave out something else. The root of gehen is ge, so we leave out the en at the end. So the root in German is infinitive minus the ending en. The same in our next sentence. Lernt Deutsch. Lernt is the third person singular of the verb lernen, to study. Lernen is our infinitive. And again, in order to get the root, you leave out the ending en. So the root is lern. You'll see in a minute where I'm getting with this. And the same also goes for our last sentence. Sie schauen einen Film. They are watching a movie. As I already mentioned, we don't use a progressive form here because we don't have any in German. So the sentence they are watching a movie would be the same as they watch a movie in German. They watch a movie, Sie schauen einen Film. Sie schauen is the third person plural of the verb schauen, to watch. And again, we get the root by leaving out the ending en, so the root of schauen would be schau. But what do we need the root for? In order to form the present, das Präsens, in German we need the root of the verb, which we now learned, is the infinitive minus the ending en, and then we add the presens ending. Remember, that's the same thing as in English, just with the exception that English only has two presens endings, either the root itself or the root plus s. German has a little more than that. We have the ending e for the first person singular, st for the second person singular, t for the third person singular, in for the first person plural, t for the second person plural, and finally again in for the third person plural. If we take the verb machen, for example, to make, we could conjugate it like this. Ich mache, du machst, sie es macht, wir machen, ihr macht, and sie machen. So we take the root of the verb, in this case mach, the root of machen, because we've left out the en of the infinitive, machen becomes mach, and then we add the presens ending. Mache, machst, macht, machen, macht, machen. And that's the way we form a presens in German. Now it's your turn. In the following, I will be giving you a verb, and your task is to conjugate it in the presens in German. I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's take the verb suchen, for example. So I give you the verb suchen, to search, and what you do now is conjugate it. You do this by first getting the root of the verb. Remember, that's just the infinitive minus en, in this case such. So suchen minus en equals such. And then we add the presens endings. So we have ich suche, du suchst, sie es sucht, wir suchen, ihr sucht, and sie suchen. One more time. Ich suche, du suchst, sie es sucht, wir suchen, ihr sucht, and sie suchen. The words on the left, so ich, du, sie, es, and so on, are called personal pronouns. They are the same as I, you, he, she, it, and so on in English. So remember, if you have the infinitive, you just leave out the en and get the root of the verb, and then you add the presens ending. Are you ready for the next one? This time you're on your own. We'll take the verb Trinken, to drink. Trinken. If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be ich trinke, du trinkst, sie es trinkt, wir trinken, ihr trinkt, and sie trinken. We get the root trink by leaving out the en, so we have trink, and then you just add the present endings. Ich trinke, du trinkst, sie es trinkt, wir trinken, ihr trinkt, and sie trinken. Not that difficult, right? Let's have one more. This time we have the verb spielen, to play. Spielen. Again, if you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct answer would be ich spiele, du spielst, sie es spielt, wir spielen, ihr spielt, and sie spielen. Again, we get the root by leaving out the en in the infinitive, so spielen becomes Spiel, and then we just add the present endings. Ich spiele, du spielst, sie es spielt, wir spielen, ihr spielt, and sie spielen. Once you know that, it's actually not that difficult, right? And remember, it's the only present tense that we have in German, so you don't need to learn another one. So you just take the root of the verb and add the present ending. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? In the following, we now have a quiz where you can practice the endings and an exercise where you can do the same thing that we just did. I'll give you an infinitive in German and your task is to conjugate the verb. So to write down the correct forms for example, ich spiele, du spielst, and so on. And with enough practice, I'm sure that in a few minutes, this will all be a piece of cake. But German wouldn't be German if there wouldn't be some irregular forms. And that's where the real challenge begins. But more on that in our next video. Bis gleich. See you soon. Great, so now that you know how to form the present in German, let's have a look at the irregular forms in the present, im Präsens. So as we learned in our last lesson, we form the Präsens by taking the root of the verb and then adding the Präsens ending. We get the root of the verb by taking the infinitive and leaving out the ending en. So for example, machen becomes mach, and then we add the Präsens ending, which is st, t, and so on. And the vast majority of all verbs in German follow these rules. They are called regular verbs. Regelmäßige Verben. The opposite, so all of the verbs that don't follow these rules, are called unregelmäßige Verben, irregular verbs. They have at least one exception to this rule. The good thing is, most really only have one exception to this rule. And also, most of the exceptions are in the singular forms. Not all, but most of them. In most cases, the plural forms stay regular. But why do these irregular verbs or irregular forms exist in the first place? Just like in English, French, Spanish, or other languages, it's always the same case. Irregular verbs are verbs that used to follow the same rules as the regular verbs, but because speakers are lazy, they dropped some syllables. And that's how these exceptions came into being. Most of the time, the exceptions make it easier to speak, so to pronounce these words. But this only happens to verbs that are used often, and that's also the reason why many of the irregular verbs belong to the most used verbs in German, in English, and in many other languages as well. So now, let's take a look at the irregular verbs in German together. As we just learned, they are all the verbs that have at least one exception to the normal rules. So you can imagine there are many different exceptions. But let's try to group them. For example, there are verbs that have a verb stem which ends in either s, the sharp s, x, or z. So a sibilant, a sound like ts, s, or x. In these cases, we'll remove the s in the second person singular ending. And if you think about it, that's pretty logical. Take the verb tanzen for example, to dance. Tanzen. It is conjugated like this. Ich tanze, du tanzt, sie es tanzt, wir tanzen, ihr tanzt, and sie tanzen. If tanzen would be a regular verb and would follow the normal rules, the second person singular would be tanzt with ZST. But because ZST is something that nobody can really pronounce, people made it easier and left out the S, and that's our irregularity. Du tanzt. ZT instead of ZST. So it's basically because of pronunciation reasons that it was left out. And the same goes for all of the other verbs that have a word stem that ends in S, sharp S, X or Z. Logical, isn't it? The same also goes for our next group of irregular verbs, and those are verbs that have a stem that ends in either D or T. For example, warten, to wait. Its stem is wart, so it ends in a T. That's why it's conjugated like this. Ich warte, du wartest, sie es wartet, wir warten, ihr wartet, and sie warten. So as you can see, in front of the endings st and t, so in the second and third person singular and the second person plural, we add an I. Ich warte, du wartest, sie es wartet, and then again in ihr wartet, we always add an E or I. And the same goes for all of the other verbs whose stems end in either D or T. Ich warte, du wartest, sie es wartet, wir warten, ihr wartet, sie warten. Another example would be reden, for example, to talk. Ich rede, du redest, sie es redet, wir reden, ihr redet, sie reden. This verb ends in a D. That's why we use the same endings. And we add the E. Got it? So those are the logical ones. Then there are also some which are not that logical. So the ones where there is not really a group of verbs that share the same similarity. There are some verbs that have a different ending in the second and third person singular, for example, but they don't share the same characteristics. So there is no triggering feature like in the other groups we had. But those are only a few. The two most popular and most used ones are haben, to have, and essen, to eat. If we conjugate haben, for example, we would conjugate it like this. Ich habe, du hast, sie es hat, wir haben, ihr habt, and sie haben. So you can see that the first person singular and all of the plural forms are actually regular. The problem are the second and third person singular, where we leave out the B. If it would be regular, the endings would need to be habst and habt. Du habst, and sie es habt. But they clearly are not. They are hast and hat. And that has to do with the reason that habst and habt is pretty difficult to pronounce. That's why over time people made it easier to pronounce, because you know, haben or to have is a verb that you use very, very often. That's why over time it changed to hast or hat. Always remember, speakers are lazy, and that's why they sometimes drop letters or syllables. And that's how irregular forms emerge in every language. Same also in English. Keep that in mind when we take a look at our next verb, essen, to eat. Here again, the first person singular and all of the plural forms are regular. Ich esse, wir essen, ihr esst, sie essen. The problem are the second and the third person singular. Du isst and sie es isst. If essen would be regular, the second person singular would be esst with 3 s's. So the ess from the root plus the ending st. And 3 s sounds is something that never occurs in the German language. That's why it was reduced to 1 s. That's why the ending in the second and the third person singular is the same. Now, why do we use I instead of E? Ist instead of est? This has also to do with spoken language and the fact that if you're talking pretty fast, and the fact that and es, so 2 of the 3 personal pronouns in the third person singular, starts with an E, it's easier to pronounce ist than est, or es ist than es est. And that's how du isst and sie es isst emerged as the normal forms for the second and third person singular of the verb essen. So now you know why they exist. Now the problem is to learn those things. This is not something that you learn overnight, but to make it easier for you, I made a list with the most important irregular verbs in German, and you can find it in the additional material to this lesson. You don't need to learn them all at once, and most of the time it's actually not that much of a deal if you form the verb like a regular verb instead of an irregular verb. It just shows that you are not a native speaker. If that's okay for you, no problem. But still, over time you will learn it. Now finally, let's take a look at 2 completely irregular verbs. There is one that's really striking the eye, and it's the verb sein, to be. Sein is completely irregular. just like in English. I mean, think about it. To be. I am, you are, he, she, it is, we are, you are, they are. That's completely different from a regular verb in English, like to play, for example. I play, you play, he, she, it plays, we play, you play, they play. And just like to be is completely different from all of the other verbs in English, sein is also completely different from the other verbs in German. And although I don't really like learning things by heart, that's the only advice that I can give you for the verb sein. It's really important. And it's conjugated like this. Ich bin, du bist, sie, es ist, wir sind, ihr seid, and sie sind. Some of the forms are actually pretty similar to English. For example, sie, es ist, he, she, it is. And it's really important to know this verb. Sein is often used as an Hilfsverb, as an auxiliary verb. And it is important for some of the other tenses that we will learn in this course. So if there is one verb that you definitely need to learn by heart, it is sein. It's the only irregular verb in the German language where all of the persons are irregular. The next worst thing, so to say, that can happen are verbs like wissen, where all of the singular forms are irregular. Wissen means to know. And as you can see, all of its plural forms are regular. The problem are the singular forms. Ich weiß, du weißt, and sie, es weiß. Those three forms have emerged due to historical reasons, and they make these words easier to pronounce. Ich weiß, du weißt, sie, es weiß. But as I already mentioned, apart from the verbs sein and maybe also haben, all of the other irregular verbs will come over time. You don't need to learn them all at once, but I will attach you a very helpful document in the additional material. This document will help you learn the irregular verbs in German, and it focuses on the ones that are used most often. Alright, enough about the irregular verbs in the present. Now we'll have another exercise and a quiz about the irregular forms and the present tense in general, and once we're done with that, we'll move on with our next tense, the past tenses. In the next lesson, we will take a look at the different past tenses in German and how they differ from another. Bis gleich, see you soon. Now that you know about the present tense in German, das Präsens, let's take a look at the past tenses. As we learned in the intro, every language needs to have at least 3 tenses. One past tense, one present tense, and one future tense. But most languages have more than that. And the past tenses in German are called Vergangenheitsformen, because past in German means Vergangenheit, and Vergangenheitsformen means past forms or past tenses. So what Vergangenheitsformen are there? Let's first take a look at the past tenses in English. Here we have the simple past progressive, the present perfect and the present perfect progressive, and the past perfect and the past perfect progressive. So you see 3 tenses plus their progressive forms. Makes a total of 6 past forms in English. In German we only have half of that amount. We only have 3 past forms. Präteritum, perfect and plusquamperfect. And the cool thing is, they are actually pretty close to the English versions. We use the Präteritum, where you would use the simple past or the simple past progressive. We use the perfect, where you would use the present perfect and present perfect progressive. And we use the plusquamperfect, where you would use the past perfect and past perfect progressive. So basically the main difference is that we don't have a progressive form. Their formation is also not too far away from their English counterparts. But you will learn more on that in each individual video. In the following video lessons we will take a look at each of these tenses and we will see how they are formed and when we use them. But before we do that, one more thing. Remember, in the intro video I told you that there is one past tense that we use in most cases, and that past tense is the perfect. It's like the past form that we use in spoken language, and that's why we use it in about 60% of all cases. The Präteritum, on the other hand, is mainly used in written language. It's more like a descriptive past tense. And that's the past tense that we use the second most often, about 30% of all cases. And then there is the plusquamperfect. This tense, like the past perfect in English, is used to say that something happens even further in the past than something else. So while the Präteritum and the perfect show something that happens in the past, the plusquamperfect shows that something happened even further in the past. So that's the main difference. The perfect is used most of the time, and especially in spoken language. The Präteritum is the second most used past tense in German, and it's mainly used in written language. and the plusquamperfekt is the least used one, and we use it to show that something happens even further in the past than something else. With that in mind, let's start with our first past tense in German, the Präteritum. In our next lesson, we will take a look at how it is formed and when we use it. Bis gleich, see you soon. Let's start with our first past tense, the Präteritum. So, what is the Präteritum and how is it formed? The Präteritum is the German equivalent of the simple past in English. For example, I played soccer yesterday. That's the simple past. In English it is formed by taking the word stem and then adding the simple past ending, which most of the time is just ed. For example, played or cooked, for example. But there can also be some irregular endings, but more on that later. In German it's almost the same. Here we also take the word stem and then we add some endings. In this case, not the simple past ending, but our Präteritum ending. For example, machte, wollte, and so on. But because in German we conjugate verbs, unlike English, we have an individual Präteritum ending for each grammatical person. They are te, test, te, ten, tet, and ten. If, for example, we take the verb spielen, to play, we first need to get its word stem. As we learned in an earlier lesson, we get the word stem by leaving out the ending en in the infinitive. Spielen is an infinitive, so we need to leave out the ending en. So we have Spiel, and Spiel is our word stem. And we now just need to add the Präteritum endings. So te, test, te, ten, tet, and ten. And then we get the following conjugation. Ich spielte, du spieltest, sie es spielte, wir spielten, ihr spieltet, sie spielten. Ich spielte, I played, du spieltest, you played, sie es spielte, he she it played, wir spielten, we played, ihr spieltet, you played, sie spielten, they played. Apart from the fact that in German verbs need to be conjugated, it's basically the same thing as in English. Just the word stem plus the Präteritum ending. Got it? Okay, then now it's your turn. In the following, I will be giving you a verb, for example, kochen, to cook, and your task is to conjugate the verb in the Präteritum. So in this particular case, you would need to reduce kochen to its verb stem, koch, and then you need to add the Präteritum endings. So the solution would be, ich kochte, du kochtest, sie es kochte, wir kochten, ihr kochtet, and sie kochten. Ich kochte, du kochtest, sie es kochte, wir kochten, ihr kochtet, and sie kochten. Not that difficult, right? You just take the word stem and then add the Präteritum endings. With our next verb, you're on your own. This time we have the verb suchen, to search. Suchen. If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be, ich suchte, du suchtest, sie es suchte, wir suchten, ihr suchtet, sie suchten. The word stem of suchen is such, and then you just add the Präteritum endings. Ich suchte, du suchtest, sie es suchte, wir suchten, ihr suchtet, and sie suchten. Are you ready for one more? This time we will take the verb bauen, to build. Bauen. Again, if you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be, ich baute, du bautest, sie es baute, wir bauten, ihr bautet, and sie bauten. The verb stem or word stem of bauen is bau, and then you just add the Präteritum endings te, test, te, ten, tet, and ten. And that's how you get the conjugation ich baute, du bautest, sie es baute, wir bauten, ihr bautet, and sie bauten. Not that difficult, right? And for most verbs, that's the way we do it. But German wouldn't be German if there wouldn't be some exceptions and some irregular verbs. In fact, in English you even have the same thing, and in English there are even some more irregular verbs. Let's take a look. Maybe you already heard of the 3 forms of irregular verbs in English. They are these forms like do, did, done, speak, spoke, spoken, and so on. They are basically the infinitive, the simple past form, and the past participle. And in English, there are actually a lot of these forms that are irregular. I mean, if do would be regular, it would be do, doed, doed. Or if speak would be regular, it would be speak, speaked, speaked. But it isn't. And the same thing also goes for German. Here we also have these three forms. The three forms of irregular verbs in German are die drei Formen der unregelmäßigen Verben. Die drei Formen der unregelmäßigen Verben. We also have the infinitive, then the Präteritum form, which corresponds to the simple past form in English, and the Partizip 2, which is the same as the past participle in English. So basically the same thing. And what's also cool about it is that basically the same verbs that are irregular in English are also irregular in German. In German they're a little less, but still it's most of the time it's the same verbs. For example, if you take the verb to do, as we just saw, the three forms would be do, did and done in English, and in German they would be tun, tat and getan. Do, did, done, tun, tat, getan. Or if we take speak, spoke, spoken, the German equivalent would be sprechen, sprach and gesprochen. Sprechen, sprach and gesprochen. What we now need for our Präteritum is the second form, in this case tat or sprach. I'll show you with the verb sprechen what I mean by that. If you want to conjugate the verb sprechen in the Präteritum, and as you know, sprechen is an irregular verb, you take a look at the three forms of sprechen, and you see that the Präteritum form is sprach. Now, unlike English, in German there still needs to be conjugated. But this time, the root of sprechen is not sprech, but sprach. So we take this Präteritum form and use it as our root. And then we just need to add the Präteritum endings, but there's a little catch. We just learned that for regular verbs, the Präteritum endings are st, t, ten, tet and ten. For irregular verbs, however, it's a little different. Here, the first and third person singular don't have an ending at all, so the root stays the same, as you can see in ich sprach and sie es sprach. And the other endings are st for the second person singular and then n, t and n in the plural. This may seem confusing right now, but the cool thing is, unlike the irregular verbs in the presens, here we don't have any exceptions. Once you know the three forms of the irregular verbs, die drei Formen der unregelmäßigen Verben, it's actually fairly easy. And of course you can find a table with all of these three forms in the additional material. But let's stay with the example of sprechen. So we take sprach as our root and then we add the irregular endings. So ich sprach, du sprachst, sie es sprach, wir sprachen, ihr spracht and sie sprachen. Sprach is our root and we use the endings on the right, the irregular endings. Let's have one more example. This time we'll take one of the most important verbs in German, haben, to have. The three forms of the verb haben are haben, hatte and gehabt. You see, it's an irregular verb. So the Präteritum form of the first person singular becomes our root. In this case, hatte. Ich hatte. What we're going to do now is add the endings for irregular verbs in the Präteritum. Ich hatte, du hattest, sie es hatte, wir hatten, ihr hattet and sie hatten. One more time. You take hatte, the Präteritum form of the first person singular, and then you add the endings on the right, so the endings for the irregular verbs in the Präteritum. The first and third person singular don't get an ending at all, so we have ich hatte and sie es hatte. The second person singular gets the ending st, so we had du hattest, and our plural endings are in, t and n, so wir hatten, ihr hattet and sie hatten. And this goes for all of the irregular verbs out there. There is no exception. Let's have one more example. The verb können. Können is also an irregular verb. The three forms of können are können, konnte and gekonnt. As you know by now, the form that we need is the second one, konnte. So in order to be able to conjugate it, we take konnte as our verb stem and then we add the irregular endings. So we conjugate it like this. Ich konnte, du konntest, sie es konnte, wir konnten, ihr konntet and sie konnten. Ich konnte, du konntest, sie es konnte, wir konnten, ihr konntet and sie konnten. Not that difficult, isn't it? Now it's your turn again. Based on what we've just learned, your task is to conjugate an irregular verb that I give you. I'll give you the infinitive of the irregular verb and its three forms. So for example, denken, to think, and the three forms of denken are denken, dachte, and gedacht. Based on that, how can you conjugate it? If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be ich dachte, du dachtest, sie es dachte, wir dachten, ihr dachtet, and sie dachten. How do we get to that solution? First, you need to look for the Präteritum form of denken, which was dachte, dachte. Then you add the irregular endings, which you can see in the top right corner, and then you just add them. And you get ich dachte, du dachtest, sie es dachte, wir dachten, ihr dachtet, and sie dachten. It's as easy as that. Let's have one more, the verb kommen, to come. The three forms of kommen are kommen, kam, gekommen. Kommen, kam, gekommen. Based on that, how do you conjugate kommen in the Präteritum? If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be ich kam, du kamst, sie es kam, wir kamen, ihr kamt, and sie kamen. We take the Präteritum form kam and then add the irregular endings. This gives us the forms ich kam, du kamst, sie es kam, wir kamen, ihr kamt, and sie kamen. So as you can see, the verbs that are irregular verbs, both in German and in English, are verbs that appear very often. As I already mentioned in the video about the presents, that's due to the fact that speakers are lazy, and most of the time the irregularities are things that make these verbs easier to pronounce, and that's how they formed. Are you up for the ultimate challenge? Let's have a look at the most difficult verb in German, sein, to be. The three forms of the verb sein are sein, war, and gewesen. Sein, war, gewesen. In English, be, was or were, and bin. Sein, war, and gewesen. Based on that, are you able to conjugate it? If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. If you manage to conjugate this verb, then congrats, then you're able to conjugate all of the verbs in the Präteritum. So, the correct answer would be ich war, du warst, sie es war, wir waren, ihr wart, and sie waren. The Präteritum form of sein is war. So what we need to do now is just take war as our root and then add the irregular endings. This gives us the conjugation ich war, du warst, sie es war, wir waren, ihr wart, and sie waren. If you did this correctly, then congrats, then you've mastered the Präteritum. It's not gonna get any more difficult than that. As you can see, as long as you know the three forms of the irregular verbs, things are actually pretty easy. But the problem about this is that you need to know the three forms. And in order to do so, in the additional material, you can find a detailed document where you can find the three forms of all the irregular verbs in German. Unfortunately, that's something that you should really learn by heart, because those verbs are really important. I needed to do the same thing for English, and English has even more irregular verbs than German. Once you know these three forms, the rest is actually not that difficult. And as you probably already noticed, the regular verbs are even easier. So now it's time for some more practice. In the following, we'll have a quiz on the regular verbs and the irregular verbs and some exercises around these topics. And once we're done with all of that, we will move on to our next past tense, the perfect. The most used past tense in German. Bis gleich. See you soon. Let's move on with the most used past tense in German, the perfect. The perfect is mainly used in spoken language, and it's our equivalent of the present perfect in English. But what was the present perfect again? Sentences like I have played with him or we have talked for a while are sentences that use the present perfect. They use the auxiliary verb to have and the past participle of the corresponding verb. For example, have played in the first sentence and have talked in the second sentence. And you will see that the German equivalent, the perfect, is not too far off from that. In German, we use the auxiliary verbs or Hilfsverben haben and sein, to have and to be. And then we add something that is called Partizip 2, our version of the past participle. The two sentences in German would be Ich habe mit ihm gespielt, I have played with him, ich habe mit ihm gespielt, and wir haben eine Weile geredet, we have talked for a while, wir haben eine Weile geredet. Let's first focus on the first part, the auxiliary verbs haben and sein. As you probably remember, haben is conjugated like this. Ich habe, du hast, sie es hat, wir haben, ihr habt, and sie haben. Sein, on the other hand, is conjugated like this. Ich bin, du bist, sie es ist, wir sind, ihr seid, and sie sind. But when do we use which of the two? Most of the time we use haben as our Hilfsverb, to have. For example, hoffen, können, and so on all use haben as their Hilfsverb. Sein, on the other hand, is only used with verbs that indicate movement or change. For example, laufen, fliegen, or sein. So to walk, to fly, and to be, for example. Everything else, so all of the other verbs, use haben. So if in doubt, use haben. Don't worry, if you confuse the two, native speakers can usually still understand you. The only problem is, it sounds really odd. So haben in most of the cases and sein in verbs that indicate movement or change. Let's practice that. In the following, I will give you a verb, and your task is to decide whether we use haben or sein. So for example, I could give you the verb reden, and your task would be to say if we use the Hilfsverb haben in the perfect or sein. And because reden, to talk, doesn't indicate any action and any movement, we use the Hilfsverb or auxiliary verb haben. For example, the sentence I talked would be Ich habe geredet. Ich habe geredet. Now the second part, so geredet, doesn't really matter for now. The only thing that's important for us is that we use haben and not sein. Are you ready for another example? This time it's your turn. Our verb is schwimmen, to swim. Schwimmen. Do we use haben in this case or do we use sein? What do you think? The correct answer would be sein, because schwimmen indicates movement. And as we just learned, verbs that indicate movement use the Hilfsverb sein. So for example, if you want to say I have swum or I swam, in German this would be Ich bin geschwommen. Ich bin geschwommen. And bin is the first person singular of sein. We use sein as our Hilfsverb. Okay, let's have one more. This time our verb is spielen, to play. Spielen. Which Hilfsverb or auxiliary verb would we use here? Haben or sein? If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct answer would be haben. For example, if you want to say I have played, in German this would be Ich habe gespielt. Ich habe gespielt. And habe is the first person singular of haben. Spielen is not a verb that indicates movement or change, and that's why we use haben as our Hilfsverb. Are you ready for one final example? This time our verb is fahren, to drive. Fahren. This one is fairly easy, but what do you think? Which Hilfsverb do we use here? Sein or haben? Again, if you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution here would be the verb sein, because fahren indicates movement, to drive. And as we learned, verbs that indicate movement always use sein as their Hilfsverb. Therefore, if you wanted to say, for example, I have driven, in German this would be Ich bin gefahren. Ich bin gefahren. And bin is the first person singular of sein. Okay, I think the Hilfsverb is clear. So part 1 of the perfect is done. Now let's move on with part 2, the Partizip 2, aka Partizip Perfekt, the German version of the past participle. In regular verbs, it's formed like this. You take the root of the verb. For example, if you take the verb haben, the root would be hab. And then you add ge at the front and t at the back. So haben becomes gehabt. And wollen, for example, to want to, would become gewollt. The root of wollen is woll. And then you just add ge at the front, ge, and t at the back, t. Gewollt. So far so good. Now it's your turn again. I will give you a verb and your task is to convert the verb into a past participle form. Remember, in German we form this by starting with ge, so ge, then we take the root of the verb and then we add t. For example, if I give you kochen, you first need to find out the root of kochen. And that's pretty easy because you just need to leave out the en at the end of kochen, so the infinitive ending. So the root of kochen is koch. Now you just need to add the ge at the front, ge, and the t at the back, and tada! The past participle or Partizip Perfekt, Partizip 2, of kochen is gekocht. Gekocht. Now you're on your own. The next verb is schauen, to watch. Schauen. What's the past participle of schauen? If you like, you can post a video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be geschaut. Geschaut. The root of schauen is schau, and then we just add the ge at the front and the t at the back. Geschaut. Are you ready for another one? This time we take the verb hoffen, to hope. Hoffen. How do you form the past participle here? The correct answer would be gehofft. Gehofft. Hoff is the root of hoffen. And then again you add ge at the front and t at the back. Gehofft. So far, so easy, but German wouldn't be German if there wouldn't be any exceptions. But this time we really have you covered. Remember the 3 forms of irregular verbs that we learned in the last video? So in English this would be verbs like do, did, done, swear, swore, sworn, and so on. And in German these 3 forms also exist. The first form is always the infinitive, the second one is the Präteritum form, so the simple past form, and the third one, you guessed it, is the Partizip 2, the past participle. So all you need to do is take a look at the table in the additional material, look for the verb, and then take the third form. In the case of tun, this would be getan, and in the case of schwören, this would be geschworen. By the way, those are the same examples that I had in English. So do, did, done in German would be tun, tat and getan, and swear, swore, sworn would be schwören, schwor and geschworen in German. Do you see the similarity? So some of the exceptions in both German and English even have the same root. So that's all you need to know to form the perfect in German. Let's put it all together. We form the perfect by taking the Hilfsverb haben or sein, of which we learned that in most cases we use haben, but sein is used for verbs that indicate movement or change. And then after the Hilfsverb we add the Partizip 2. Most of the time we form the Partizip 2 by taking the root of our verb and then just adding ge at the front and t at the back. For example, machen would become gemacht, wollen would become gewollt, and so on. And for all of the irregular forms, the past participle is simply the third form in our irregular verbs table. So each irregular verb, like gehen for example, to go, has 3 irregular forms. The infinitive, the simple past form or Präteritum form, and the past participle or Partizip 2. All you need to do is look for the Partizip 2, in this case gegangen. Gehen, ging, gegangen. And that's it. That way you can form sentences like Ich bin in die Schule gegangen, for example. Bin gegangen. Ich bin in die Schule gegangen. Er hat es gewusst. He knew it. Er hat es gewusst. Ich habe einen Artikel gelesen. Habe gelesen. Have read. Wir sind nach Berlin geflogen. Sind geflogen. And so on. We always have the Hilfsverb or auxiliary verb at first. And then we add the Partizip Perfekt. Now to its usage, because there's a little difference between the past perfect in English and the perfect in German. While the present perfect in English is mainly used for actions in the past that still have relevance for the present, the perfect in German is used for almost all actions in the past in spoken language. So it's our past form for spoken language. That's why we also use it to translate sentences that use the simple past in English. For example, he knew it in spoken language wouldn't be wusste es, so the Präteritum, but it would be hat es gewusst. Perfect. Or I went to school wouldn't be ich ging zur Schule, so Präteritum or simple past, but it would be ich bin in die Schule gegangen, but only in spoken language. Remember, in most cases, we use the Präteritum in written language and the perfect in spoken language. And that's basically all you need to know about it. Now it's time for some more practice. In the following, we will have some exercises that will help you learn the Partizip 2 or Partizip Perfekt, the formation of the perfect, and when to use it. And once we're done with that, we'll already move on with our final past tense in German, the Plusquamperfekt. Bis gleich. See you soon. Let's move on with our third and final past tense in German, the Plusquamperfekt. The Plusquamperfekt is the least used of all three past tenses in German, and it is also the most complicated one. But with all that you know so far, you will see that it's actually not that difficult. The Plusquamperfekt is the German equivalent of the past perfect in English, and I sometimes refer to it as the Präteritum of the perfect. You will see in just a minute what I mean by that. So first, let's take a look at the past perfect in English. Some example sentences for the past perfect are, for example, I had walked with him, I had walked with him, or we had known him for a long time. We had known him for a very long time. So as you can see, it's formed by taking had, the simple past form of to have, and then adding the past participle. Had walked, for example, or had known. And in German, it's almost the same. The two sentences in German would be Ich war mit ihm gelaufen, I had walked with him, ich war mit ihm gelaufen, and wir hatten ihn lange gekannt, we had known him for a long time, wir hatten ihn lange gekannt. So here we also have the Hilfsverb, haben, to have, and also sein, to be, but we don't have their normal present form, we use their Präteritum form instead. Remember, the Präteritum was the German equivalent of the simple past in English. So just like have had become had in the past perfect, in German, haben and sein become hatte or war. And the rest is just the same as in the perfect. We add the Partizip 2, the German version of the past participle, and that's it. War gelaufen, for example, oder hatte gekannt. So in terms of structure, this is the most complicated tense of all of the three. But with all that you know so far, you'll see it's actually not that difficult. It's basically just a mixture of the two other past tenses, of the Präteritum and the perfect. But now you might be wondering, why is the past participle at the end of the sentence in German? So for example, in the sentence Ich war mit ihm gelaufen, war is in the position where a normal verb goes, and gelaufen, the Partizip 2, is at the end of the sentence. So instead of saying I had walked with him, just like in English where we have the verb second and the past participle third, and then we add the rest. In German we have the Hilfsverb or verb second, war. Then we have the rest of the sentence, and then finally we have the Partizip 2. So keep that in mind when you form a sentence in the Plusquamperfekt. Now let's have a look at the first part. The Präteritum forms of the Hilfsverben, auxiliary verbs, haben and sein. They are ich hatte, du hattest, er sie es hatte, Wir hatten, ihr hattet, and sie hatten for the verb haben. Ich hatte, du hattest, er, sie, es hatte, wir hatten, ihr hattet, and sie hatten. And for the verb sein, it was ich war, du warst, er, sie, es war, wir waren, ihr wart, and sie waren. So, for example, we had flown, in German would be wir waren geflogen. We had flown, wir waren geflogen. And you had asked, in German would be ihr hattet gefragt. Ihr hattet gefragt. The difference between sein and haben, so when to use sein and when to use haben, is exactly the same as we saw in the last video with the perfect. In most cases we use haben, so in this case hatte, hattest, hatte, hatten, hattet, and hatten. We only use sein for verbs that indicate either movement or some sort of change. If we take fliegen, for example, to fly, this is definitely a verb that indicates movement. That's why we use sein as the Hilfsverb in this case. And in the Plusquamperfekt, the forms that we use are war, warst, war, waren, wart, and waren. So, because we are looking for the first person plural, wir, the corresponding Hilfsverb would be waren, the first person plural of sein in the Präteritum. And what then follows is just the Partizip 2, the past participle, which we already learned in the last lesson. And there's nothing that changed compared to the perfect. So always remember, the Plusquamperfekt is basically just the Präteritum of the perfect. And while the perfect was haben or sein plus Partizip 2, the Plusquamperfekt is the Präteritum forms of haben and sein plus the Partizip 2 or Partizip Perfekt. The only thing that changes compared to the perfect are the forms of the Hilfsverben haben and sein. Everything else is exactly the same as in the perfect. Got it? Great, so now it's your turn. We'll now have an exercise where I give you a sentence in the perfect in German and your task is to convert it from perfect into Plusquamperfekt. For example, if I give you the sentence Sie sind gefahren, they have driven, your task is to convert it into the Plusquamperfekt. They had driven. As we just learned, we do this by adapting the Hilfsverb. The Partizip 2, so in this case gefahren, stays exactly the same. What we need to do is use the Präteritum form of our Hilfsverb. Sind comes from the verb to be, and it's actually the third person plural. So what we need now is the third person plural in the Präteritum of sein, and that's waren. Sie waren. So the sentence Sie sind gefahren and the Plusquamperfekt would be Sie waren gefahren. Got that? Good. Then now you're on your own. Our next sentence is Ich habe gefunden. Ich habe gefunden. Please convert this sentence from the perfect into the Plusquamperfekt. If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. So the same sentence, ich habe gewonnen, in the Plusquamperfekt would be ich hatte gewonnen. Ich hatte gewonnen. Our Hilfsverb is haben, and all we need to do is use its Präteritum form. In this case, hatte. Ich hatte. The Partizip 2, so gewonnen, stays exactly the same. Are you ready for another example? This time our sentence is Du hast gekocht. Du hast gekocht. How do we convert this from the perfect into the Plusquamperfekt? If you like, again, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be Du hattest gekocht. Du hattest gekocht. Our Hilfsverb is haben in its second person singular. Du hast. And all we need to do is convert it into its Präteritum form, which would be du hattest. Du hattest. The Partizip 2, gekocht, would stay the same. Du hattest gekocht. Du hast gekocht is you have cooked, and du hattest gekocht is you had cooked. You had cooked. Are you ready for one final example? This time we will convert an entire sentence. Wir sind im Urlaub gewesen. Wir sind im Urlaub gewesen. We have been on vacation. We have been on holiday. Please convert this sentence from the perfect into the plus, （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. （+）. ）. （+）. （+）. ）. （+）. ）. （+）. ）. （+）. ）. （+）. ）. So again, although we have slightly more words, basically the only thing that you need to do is look for the Hilfsverb, in this case sind, the first person plural of sein, to be, and convert it into its Präteritum form, which is wir waren. Wir waren, we were. And the rest stays the same. Wir sind im Urlaub gewesen, we have been on vacation, becomes wir waren im Urlaub gewesen, we had been on vacation. Very good. What you can also see in this sentence is that both in the perfect and the plusquamperfect, the Hilfsverb, in this case sein, occupies the second position, so the position of the normal verb, and the Partizip 2, in this case gewesen, is at the end of the sentence. That's a difference to English. In English, we would say we have been or had been on vacation, so on vacation would be at the end. In German it's different. Here the Partizip 2, gewesen, is at the end. Keep that in mind in our next exercise. Because what we're going to do now is translate into German. I'm going to give you a sentence in English which uses the past perfect, and your task is to translate it into German. Our first example sentence is he had drawn a picture. He had drawn a picture. Little side note, to draw in German means zeichnen, zeichnen, and the German term for picture is Bild. Bild. With that in mind, please translate the sentence into German. The correct answer would be er hatte ein Bild gemalt. Er hatte ein Bild gemalt. Hatte gemalt is our plusquamperfect, just like had drawn. And ein Bild is just the German term for a picture. Remember, in German, if we have a tense that involves an auxiliary verb like haben and sein, just like here in the plusquamperfect, the auxiliary verb comes first and the Partizip 2 is at the end of the sentence. Er hatte ein Bild gemalt. He had drawn a picture. Very good. Now I want to show you one of these sentences where we usually use the plusquamperfect or the past perfect. As I already mentioned, we use the plusquamperfect in sentences where we want to show that an action happened even further in the past than something else. For example, a sentence like, we had just finished dinner when he left the room. We had just finished dinner when he left the room. So the fact that he left the room already happened in the past, but we just had finished dinner happened even further in the past. That's why we had just finished dinner uses the past perfect, the plusquamperfect, and he left the room uses the simple past, the Präteritum in German. Same thing in German as well. The first part, we had just finished dinner, in German would be wir hatten gerade das Abendessen beendet. Wir hatten gerade das Abendessen beendet. Hatten beendet is also a plusquamperfect form. So we also use the plusquamperfect, the past perfect, in the first part of the sentence, because that's the part that happened earlier. Hatten gerade beendet, had just finished. The second part of the sentence, when he left the room, in German also uses a Präteritum, so a simple past form. Als das Zimmer verließ. Verließ, left. When he left the room, als das Zimmer verließ. Because to leave the room in German means das Zimmer verlassen. That's just one example out of many. So in most cases we use the plusquamperfect in situations where we want to express that something happened even further in the past than another action. That's also why it's used so rarely, because those situations don't happen that often. But still, it's an important tense and it shouldn't be underestimated. That's why in the following we will have some more exercises where you can practice both its formation and when it is used. And once we're done with that, we're going to have a little summary of all the past tenses in German. Bis gleich. See you soon. Okay, so now that we went through all of the different past tenses in German, I think it's time to give us a little breather. In this lesson, I would like to summarize all 3 past tenses in German one more time to give you a little overview and to make sure that everything is understood so far. So, as we already learned, in German we have 3 past tenses, the Präteritum, the perfect, and the plusquamperfect. And while the Präteritum is mainly used in written language, the perfect is our go-to past tense in spoken language. That's why the perfect is the most used past tense in German. For the plusquamperfekt, on the other hand, it's different. Here it doesn't matter whether you use written language or spoken language, it simply refers to actions that happen even further in the past than something else. This is rarely the case, that's why this is the least used of all three past tenses. However, it is still important. The English counterparts would be the simple past and the simple past progressive for the Präteritum, the present perfect and the present perfect progressive for the perfect, and the past perfect and past perfect progressive for the plusquamperfekt. Now let's have a look at their formation. The Präteritum is formed by taking the root of the verb, for example geh in gehen or mach in machen, and then adding the so-called Präteritum ending. Those were the endings t, test, t, ten, tet, and ten. And that's basically already it. The problem is, in the Präteritum we have many irregular verbs, but more on that later. The perfect, on the other hand, is formed by taking the conjugated version of the Hilfsverb sein or haben, and then adding something that is called Partizip 2. So sein and haben are our auxiliary verbs, just like have in have been in English. And most of the time we use haben. We only use sein if the other verb that we use either indicates action or some sort of change. For example, if you take a look at our first example sentence, ich bin gegangen, here we have the verb gehen, to go, and to go definitely is a verb that indicates movement. That's why gehen requires the Hilfsverb sein. And its first person singular is ich bin, I am, ich bin. Most other verbs, however, like in our second example sentence, sie haben gewonnen, they have won, use the auxiliary verb haben, to have. And the Partizip 2 is formed by taking the root of the verb and adding ge at the front and t at the back. That's how a regular Partizip 2 is formed. So you can see that our two example sentences don't use regular Partizip 2 forms, because otherwise they would need to end in t, but they end in en. But as I already mentioned, more on that later. Now let's have a look at our final tense, the plusquamperfekt. It is formed by using the Präteritum forms of sein and haben, our two auxiliary verbs. So, ich war, du warst, er, sie, es war, wir waren, ihr wart, and sie waren. Or, ich hatte, du hattest, er, sie, es hatte, wir hatten, ihr hattet, and sie hatten. And then again, we add the Partizip 2. As I already mentioned, it is formed by taking the root of the verb, then adding ge at the front and t at the back. For example, machen would become gemacht, haben would become gehabt, and so on. But there's a problem. All of these three tenses have something in common. They have irregular forms. What do we do if we have one of these? So, as I already mentioned, there is a table in the additional material of most of the lessons where you can find something that is called the three forms of irregular verbs. There you will find, for example, the verb kommen, to come. And the three forms of kommen are kommen, kam, and gekommen. The first form, kommen, is the infinitive. This one is not irregular. But then it gets interesting. Kam, our second form, is the Präteritum form of kommen. And as you can already see, it's an irregular form. Kam. So what the table shows us is the first person singular of the Präteritum form. Ich kam. What we now need to do is adapt it to whatever person we need. For example, you came would be du kamst. We would just need to add the ending st. Du kamst. And so on. And our third form is our Partizip 2. Gekommen. So we can also find all of the irregular Partizip 2 forms here in this table. The third form of the irregular verbs is always the Partizip 2. And as you can see, often the exception is that the ending is not a t, but an en. And that can also be seen in our example sentences. Ich bin gegangen, Sie haben gewonnen. Those are all examples for irregular Partizip 2 forms. And that's basically it. That's all you need to know about the past tenses in German. 1, they are only half of the amount of the past tenses that we have in English, so 3 instead of 6. 2. The perfect is the most used one and it's used in spoken language, while the Präteritum is mainly used in written language, and the plusquamperfekt is only used for actions that happen even further in the past than something else. And 3. Their formation is actually pretty close to English, but there is a difference, because German verbs need to be conjugated, just like sein and haben, our auxiliary verbs need to be conjugated. And then finally, 4th, there are exceptions. Many exceptions, and you can find them in the table about the 3 forms of irregular verbs. But if you know them, everything else is actually fairly easy. And that's it. Those are all of the past tenses in German. And I want to tell you a little secret. The past tenses are actually by far the most difficult tenses in German. When we're now getting to the future tenses, you will see that those are much easier. So if there is something that you should need to invest time in, it's definitely the past tenses, because the past tenses are the most difficult thing in German when it comes to tenses. You will find more exercises on the 3 past tenses in our exercise section. But for now, let's move on to the final group of tenses, the future tenses. In our next lesson, I will show you what future tenses there are in German and how they are formed. Bis gleich, see you soon. Let's move on with our final category of tenses, the future tenses. As we already learned, every language needs to have at least 3 tenses, 1 past tense, 1 present tense, and 1 future tense. In this course, we already covered the past tenses and the present tenses. So now it's time for the future tenses. And in English, there are 4 of them. The going to future, will future, future progressive, and future perfect. The first 2 are fairly easy. The going to future is included in sentences like I am going to play soccer, for example, or he is going to watch a movie. And you find the will future in sentences like I will do that, or it will rain tomorrow. So those 2 are fairly easy. They are exactly the same as their name says. The going to future involves going to, and the will future involves will. Now, the future progressive is their progressive form. One example sentence is, for example, we will be staying at the hotel. So we use will, be, and an ing form. And that's the future progressive. And then finally we have the future perfect, which is almost never used. I will have done this, for example, as a sentence in the future perfect. Or we will have played basketball. So you see, nobody really uses it. So overall we have 4 future tenses in English, of which we basically only use 3. And German is even easier. In German we only have 2 future tenses, Futur 1, future 1, and Futur 2, future 2. We use Futur 1, where you would use the going to future, will future, and future progressive, and we use Futur 2, where you would use the future perfect. And because we use the Futur 2 about as often as you use the future perfect, we almost always use Futur 1. So this is the really important future tense. We use the Futur 1 in almost 99% of all cases, and only in 1% of all cases the Futur 2. I actually couldn't really think of a situation where I ever used it. But still, we will take a look at it. But the Futur 1 is much more important. So basically, put simple, we only have 1 future tense in German, the Futur 1. Isn't that much easier than having 4/3 future tenses as in English? And what's also cool about these 2 future forms, especially the Futur 1, is that they don't have any exceptions, no irregular verbs. With so many good news, I would say we'll jump right in. In our next lesson, we will start with the Futur 1. Bis gleich, see you soon. Okay, so let's start with the by far most used and most important future tense in German, the Futur 1, future 1. The Futur 1 is our equivalent of the going to future, will future, and future progressive in German. But of these 3 tenses, the one it resembles the most to is the will future. Quick reminder, in order to form the will future in English, we just need will plus the infinitive of the verb. For example, I will go there, or the weather will be nice. Just will plus infinitive. And the Futur 1 in German is pretty similar. Here we have the verb werden and again the infinitive, in German Infinitiv. For example, ich werde gewinnen oder das Wetter wird gut sein. Just werden plus infinitive. And unlike English, where will always stays the same, werden needs to be conjugated. And werden, to become, is conjugated like this. Ich werde, du wirst, sie es wird, wir werden, ihr werdet, and sie werden. Ich werde, du wirst, sie es wird, wir werden, ihr werdet, sie werden. So for example, ich werde gewinnen, I will win. Das Wetter wird gut sein, the weather will be good or nice. Pretty easy, isn't it? Especially if you keep in mind that it's basically the only future tense in German. But there's one little thing that you need to be aware of, and that's something that we already came across in the past forms. While in English, will and go always go together, for example, I will go there, the weather will be good, we always have will plus infinitive. In German, we also use werden and the infinitive, but in German there can be words between that. If the sentence is short and only means I will win, this will be ich werde gewinnen, so the same as in English. But if you have a longer, more complicated sentence like the weather will be nice or the weather will be good, nice or good will not be at the end of the sentence like in English, but between wird and sein, so between werden and the infinitive. Das Wetter wird gut sein. We already came across this in the past tenses, where sometimes some parts of the sentences were between the Hilfsverb, auxiliary verb, and the Partizip 2, the past participle. And the same also happens here in the Futur 1, just between werden and the infinitive. Let's practice that. We'll first start with a little conversion exercise. I'll give you a sentence in the present tense, im Präsens, and your task is to convert it into the Futur 1, our future tense. For example, if I give you ich gehe, you would need to convert it into ich werde gehen. So werden plus infinitive. Ich gehe is the first person singular, so what we need to do is look for the first person singular of werden, which is ich werde, and then we just use the infinitive of gehen, which is gehen. Ich werde gehen. I will go. It's as simple as that. Let's have one more example. This time you're on your own. Our next phrase is wir spielen. Wir spielen. Please convert this phrase into the Futur 1. The correct solution would be wir werden spielen. Wir werden spielen. Wir is the first person plural, so all we need to do is look for the first person plural of werden, which is wir werden, and then we just use the infinitive of spielen, which is also spielen. So wir werden spielen. We will play. Okay, so now let's make it a little more difficult. This time we'll have a short sentence. Sie mag ihn. Sie mag ihn. Please convert this sentence into the Futur 1. Sie mag ihn. The correct answer would be sie wird ihn mögen. Sie wird ihn mögen. Sie mag ihn means she likes him, and sie wird ihn mögen means she will like him. All we need to do is look for the grammatical person of mag, which is the third person singular, sie mag. Then we look for the third person singular of our auxiliary verb werden, which is sie wird. Sie wird. And then we use the infinitive of mag, which is mögen. But this time there's also one more thing that we need to look out for, and it's the fact that if we have something in between, which in this case ihn, we squash it between our Hilfsverb, our auxiliary verb, in this case wird, and the infinitive, mögen. So our sentence is sie wird ihn mögen. Sie wird ihn mögen. Let's practice that in another example sentence. Our example sentence is ich schreibe einen Brief. I write a letter, or I am writing a letter. Ich schreibe einen Brief. Please convert this sentence into the Futur 1. The right answer would be ich werde einen Brief schreiben. I will write a letter. Ich werde einen Brief schreiben. The procedure is the same. We first take a look at the grammatical person of schreibe, ich schreibe, which is the first person singular. Then we look for the first person singular of our Hilfsverb, which is werden. Ich werde, ich werde. Then we use the infinitive of schreibe, which is schreiben. And because there are also some other parts of the sentence, in this case einen Brief, schreiben is at the end of the sentence. So einen Brief is in between the Hilfsverb werde and our infinitive schreiben. So the sentence is ich werde einen Brief schreiben. Ich werde einen Brief schreiben. I will write a letter. Okay, now we will do something else. We are now going to have a translation exercise. I will give you an English sentence in the future, so either using the will future, going to future, or future progressive. And your task is to translate it into German using the Futur 1. For example, if I give you the sentence, I will write you a message, I will write you a message, your task would be to translate this sentence into German using the Futur 1. And the correct solution would be, ich werde dir eine Nachricht schreiben. Ich werde dir eine Nachricht schreiben. I will write means ich werde schreiben, and as we just learned, the infinitive is at the end of the sentence. The rest of the sentence, you a message, dir eine Nachricht, in German is squished in between werde, our Hilfsverb, and schreiben, our infinitive. Ich werde dir eine Nachricht schreiben. Don't worry, in terms of vocabulary I will give you some tips. So let's start with our first sentence. He will read a book. He will read a book. To read in German means lesen. Lesen and a book ist ein Buch. With that in mind, please translate this sentence into German. The correct answer would be wird ein Buch lesen. Wird ein Buch lesen. Means he. Wird lesen means will read. Wird lesen, he will read. And a book is ein Buch. And as we learned, while the Hilfsverb wird has the second part of the sentence, so right after the subject, wird, lesen, the infinitive, is at the end of our sentence. So our sentence is, wird ein Buch lesen. Wird ein Buch lesen. Let's have one more. Our next sentence is, they are going to play basketball. They are going to play basketball. Please translate this sentence into German using the Futur 1. The German word for to play is spielen, and basketball in German is called Basketball. So with that in mind, please translate the sentence. The correct answer is, sie werden Basketball spielen. Sie werden Basketball spielen. Sie means they, and are going to play means werden Basketball spielen. Remember, the Futur 1 is not only used for the will future, but also for the going to future and the future progressive. So all we need to do is find out the grammatical person, which is the third person plural, they are. Then look for the third person plural of werden, which is also werden, sie werden. Then we find the infinitive of our verb, which is spielen, and put it at the end of the sentence. And everything else that in English would come after the infinitive, in German is squished between the Hilfsverb werden and the infinitive spielen. So our sentence is, sie werden Basketball spielen. Sie werden Basketball spielen. Okay, let's have one final example. This one is already a pretty tough one. Our sentence is, tomorrow at 4 o'clock I will be riding my bike. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock I will be riding my bike. Please translate this sentence into German using the Futur 1. Tomorrow in German means morgen. 4 o'clock means 4 Uhr, and to ride a bike means Fahrrad fahren. With that in mind, please translate the sentence. So you probably already noticed that this sentence is not in the going to future and also not in the will future. This sentence uses the future progressive, but as we already learned, each of these three tenses can be translated with the Futur 1 in German. So we start with tomorrow, which in German means morgen. Then we look for our subject and the main verb of our sentence. The subject is I, ich. And the main verb is to ride a bike, so ride. In German, fahren. So we know that this one needs to be in the infinitive and at the end of our sentence. So now we need our Hilfsverb, our auxiliary verb. Because we know that ich is the subject of the sentence, we need to look for the first person singular of werden, which is ich werde. Ich werde. So, morgen werde ich fahren. Morgen ich werde fahren would not be wrong, but it would sound a little weird. So, morgen werde ich fahren. Now, the only thing that's left is we need to include the rest of the sentence. And the rest of the sentence needs to be between werde, our Hilfsverb, and fahren, our main verb. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock I'll be riding my bike. Morgen werde ich 4 Uhr Fahrrad fahren. Alternatively, you could also switch around the sentence and say morgen 4 Uhr werde ich Fahrrad fahren. This would maybe be even closer to the English version. So now that I'm thinking about it, that would also be correct. Morgen 4 Uhr, tomorrow at 4 o'clock, werde ich Fahrrad fahren. I will be riding my bike. Morgen 4 Uhr werde ich Fahrrad fahren. Or alternatively, morgen werde ich 4 Uhr Fahrrad fahren. Okay, if you were able to follow me until here, you already know the Futur 1, the by far most used future tense in German. So the only tense that's left is the other future tense, the Futur 2, the least used tense in German. But in order to make this a complete course about all tenses in German, we'll cover this one as well, and that's what we're gonna do in our next video. Bis gleich, see you soon. We are almost there. It's time for our final tense. In this lesson we will learn the Futur 2, the least used tense in German. The Futur 2 is, as the name says, our second future tense. It is comparable to the future perfect in English. But what was the future perfect in English again? In English we form it by taking will, the verb to have, and then the past participle of the verb. For example, sentences like I will have walked or we will have won all use the future perfect. As you can see from these sentences, nobody really uses it. It's basically just a construct to show that something will be over at some point in the future. And this is something that really is rarely used. And the same also goes for our Futur 2 in German. Not only is it used exactly in the same situations as the future perfect in English, its structure is also pretty close. We start by using the Hilfsverb or auxiliary verb werden, which is almost like will in English, but there's the difference that werden needs to be conjugated. Ich werde, du wirst, sie es wird, wir werden, ihr werdet, and sie werden. And then after that we move on with the Partizip 2, the German version of the past participle. So unlike English, in the German Futur 2 we use the Partizip 2 at the second position, not at the third position. And then after that we use sein or haben as another Hilfsverb. Just like English uses to have. But in German, sein or haben is at the end of the Futur 2 form, not in the middle. Examples for the Futur 2 are, for example, the sentences Ich werde gegangen sein, I will have walked, ich werde gegangen sein, and wir werden gewonnen haben, we will have won, wir werden gewonnen haben. So the conjugated form of the verb werden, to become, followed by the Partizip 2 of the verb, in this case gegangen or gewonnen, and the infinitive of sein or haben. The difference when to use sein and when to use haben is exactly the same as we saw before. In most cases we use haben, and sein is only used for verbs that either involve movement or some form of change. That's why in Ich werde gegangen sein, I will have walked, we use sein because to walk, gehen, definitely involves some form of movement. In the second sentence, on the other hand, wir werden gewonnen haben, we will have won, we use haben because gewonnen, so won, doesn't involve any kind of movement. So werden plus Partizip 2 plus sein or haben. Let's practice that. In the following, I will give you a sentence in the future perfect in English, and your task is to translate it into German. We'll do the first sentence together. Our first sentence is, we will have met Peter. We will have met Peter. Will have met is our future perfect, so will plus have plus past participle of to meet, met, will have met. And if we want to translate that into German, we need to use werden plus the Partizip 2, past participle of treffen, to meet. And then we add haben, because treffen doesn't involve any form of change or movement. So the conjugated version of werden is wir werden. So the sentence starts with wir werden. Then in German we move on with Peter or Peter, because as we already learned, verb forms like this one that consist of an auxiliary verb, an Hilfsverb, and a second verb in its past participle form are separated into two. The Hilfsverb werden always goes after the subject, wir, and the rest goes at the end of the sentence. So we will have met Peter in German is wir werden Peter getroffen haben. Wir werden Peter getroffen haben. Now it's your turn. Our example sentence is she will have asked you. She will have asked you. Please translate this sentence into German using the Futur 2. So again, what we need to do here is first find out the grammatical person of the subject, which is she, third person singular. In German sie, so we need to conjugate werden with the third person singular. Sie wird. Sie wird. And the rest of the verb, have asked, moves to the end of the sentence. So the Partizip 2 plus haben. The Partizip 2 of fragen, to ask, is gefragt. Gefragt. And we add haben because fragen, to ask, doesn't involve any form of movement or change. So we have sie wird gefragt haben. But in between the auxiliary verb and the Partizip 2, we always include the rest of the sentence. In this case, you. In German, dich. Dich. The accusative of du. If you're wondering what's an accusative, then don't worry. It's one of the 4 cases in German, and if you want to learn more about it, then check out my German A2 course. In this course you will learn, among many other things, everything you need to know about the 4 cases in German, when to use them and how they are formed. All you need to know right now is that the correct translation of she will have asked you in German is sie wird dich gefragt haben. Sie wird dich gefragt haben. Okay, as you can see from our example sentences, I think it got pretty clear how rarely this tense is actually used, because, I mean, who is saying sentences like that? But let's have one final example. Our next example sentence is we will have traveled there. We will have traveled there. I will give you a little tip to make it easier for you to translate the sentence. The German term for to travel is reisen, and its Partizip 2 is gereist. Gereist. And there, in this case, can be translated with dahin. Dahin. So with that in mind, if you like, you can pause the video and try translating this sentence on your own. The correct solution would be wir werden dahin gereist sein. Wir werden dahin gereist sein. First of all, we need to look for the grammatical person of the sentence or of the subject, which is we, and we need to adapt the Hilfsverb werden accordingly. The first person plural of werden is werden, which is why we start the sentence with wir werden. And we already know that the end of the sentence needs to be the Partizip 2 of to travel and sein or haben. Now, as we now know, to travel means reisen in German, and its Partizip 2 is gereist. Gereist. Now the only question that remains is whether we use sein or haben. And because to travel or reisen involves some kind of movement or change, we use sein. So the end of the sentence is gereist sein. The only verb that's remaining is there. In German, dahin. And as we learned, in German we squish it between werden and the Partizip 2. So the sentence is wir werden dahin gereist sein. We will have traveled there. Wir werden dahin gereist sein. Okay, that's everything you need to know about the Futur 2. In the following we'll have another exercise on the Futur 2, and after that we'll summarize both future tenses one more time. Bis gleich. See you soon. Okay, so before we jump into some more exercises, let's briefly summarize the future tenses in German. As we learned, there are two future tenses in German, the Futur 1 and Futur 2, Future 1 and Future 2. The Futur 1 is the German equivalent of the going to future, the will future and the future progressive. The Futur 2, on the other hand, is the German equivalent of the future perfect. What does this mean for their usage? This means that the Futur 1 is by far the most used tense of all the two. It is used in about 99% of all future cases, and the only exception is when you talk about things that will be over at some point in the future. That's the case where you use the Futur 2. In all other cases, you use the Futur 1. Alternatively, for plans and stuff like that, you can also use the Präsens, our present tense, to talk about the future, just like in English. I go there tomorrow, for example. Ich gehe dort morgen hin. But if we stick with the tenses that were really made to talk about the future, you use the Futur 1 in 99% of all cases. Now let's have a look at how they are formed. The Futur 1 is formed by using the Hilfsverb or auxiliary verb werden and then adding the infinitive of the verb. So for example, wir werden sehen. Wir werden sehen. It is actually fairly easy because there are no exceptions, no irregular verbs, and the only thing that needs to be conjugated is werden. The Futur 2, on the other hand, is much more difficult. Here we also have the conjugated version of werden, but after that we move on with the Partizip 2. You know, this thing that we already learned when we talked about the perfect and Plusquamperfekt. In our example sentence, wir werden gesehen haben, for example, it's gesehen. That's our Partizip 2. And after that, we either have the infinitive of sein or haben. In our example sentence, it is haben, and actually in most cases it is haben. Sein is only used if the verb involves movement or some form of change. So, summarized as short as possible, in almost all cases we use the Futur 1. And the Futur 1 is formed by using the conjugated form of the Hilfsverb or auxiliary verb werden and the infinitive of the other verb. And if we have a more complicated sentence, unlike the sentences that we have right here, werden goes at position number 2 after the subject, and sehen, or the infinitive in general, is used at the end of the sentence, so everything else is squished in between. And that's all you need to know about the future tenses. Das ist alles, was du über die Zukunftsformen wissen musst. And that means we're done with all of the tenses in German. Good job! But I'm pretty sure you could use some more practice. That's why in the following we will have an entire chapter that's full with exercises about all of the tenses we've had so far. The present tenses, past tenses and future tenses. So good luck with the exercises, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I'll see you in our next video. Bis gleich. See you soon. Let's summarize all of the tenses in German one more time. As we already learned, every language needs to include at least 3 tenses. One past form, one present form and one future form. Because in every language it needs to be possible to talk about the present, to talk about the past and to talk about the future. But that's only the bare minimum. Most languages have more than just 3 tenses, and English even has 12. 6 past tenses, 2 present tenses and 4 future tenses. Makes a total of 12. German only has half of that amount. We have 3 past tenses, the Präteritum, the perfect and the Plusquamperfekt, 1 present tense, the Präsens, and 2 future tenses, Futur 1 and Futur 2. Let's take a look at each of them. We'll start with the present tense, our Präsens. The Präsens is like the normal tense. It's the most used tense in German, and it's our equivalent of the simple present and present progressive in English. Some example sentences are, for example, ich gehe zur Schule, ich gehe zur Schule, lernt Deutsch, and Sie schauen einen Film. Sie schauen einen Film. In order to form the Präsens, we first need to get the root of the verb. We do this by taking the infinitive, which in German is characterized by the ending en, and all we need to do is leave out the ending en. So for example, the root of the verb gehen, to go, is geh. And the root of the verb lernen, to study, is lern. And also the root of the verb schauen is schau. Once we have the root, all we need to do is add the presence endings. And they are for the first person singular, st for the second person singular, t for the third person singular, n for the first person plural, t for the second person plural, and again n for the third person plural. So for example, if we take the verb machen, to make, we would conjugate it like this. Ich mache, du machst, sie es macht, wir machen, ihr macht, and sie machen. So that's the presence, our most used and probably also easiest tense. Up next, we'll take a look at the past tenses, in German Vergangenheitsformen. Vergangenheitsformen. Here we have the Präteritum, the Perfekt, and the Plusquamperfekt. The Präteritum is our equivalent of the simple past in English. It's again formed by taking the root, and then we don't add the presence ending like in the presence, but the Präteritum ending. Those endings are t, test, t, ten, tet, and ten. Unlike the simple past in English, we use the Präteritum mostly in written language. The other form that we use more often is the Perfekt. It's mainly used in spoken language. And it's the German equivalent of the present perfect and present perfect progressive in English. It is formed by taking the Hilfsverb or auxiliary verb sein or haben and then adding the Partizip zwei. So sein or haben, to be or to have in their conjugated versions, so ich bin, du bist, sie es ist, wir sind, ihr seid und sie sind, or ich habe, du hast, sie es hat, wir haben, ihr habt und sie haben, plus the Partizip zwei of the verb that you're actually using. Now, if you're wondering what the Partizip zwei was, it's the German version of the past participle. For example, played, made, talked, been, and so on. Those are all examples for the Partizip zwei. In German, examples would be, for example, gemacht, getan, gewollt, and so on. The regular Partizip zwei forms are formed by taking the root of the verb and then adding ge at the front and t at the back. But there are also some irregularities that we will take a look on in just a few seconds. Let's first focus on our final past tense, the Plusquamperfekt, the past perfect. It is used for actions that happen even further in the past than something else, no matter whether it's in written language or in spoken language. It is actually the least used past tense in German. And we form it by using the Präteritum or simple past forms of sein and haben, to be and to have. So for example, ich war, du warst, sie es war, wir waren, ihr wart, and sie waren in the case of sein, to be, and ich hatte, du hattest, sie es hatte, wir hatten, ihr hattet, and sie hatten in the case of haben, to have. The rest is exactly the same as in the perfect, we just add the Partizip zwei, which doesn't change. So the Plusquamperfekt can basically be described as the Präteritum of the perfect. It's basically a mixture of these two tenses. In order to make the difference clearer, let's have a look at some example sentences. For example, I went, in German would be ich ging, Präteritum. Ich ging, the corresponding perfect form would be ich bin gegangen, I have gone. And the corresponding Plusquamperfekt form would be ich war gegangen, I had gone, ich war gegangen. Let's have another example. This time we start with they won, sie gewannen, sie gewannen. Again, this is a Präteritum form, a simple past form. And the corresponding perfect form would be sie haben gewonnen, they have won. Sie haben gewonnen, they have won. And the corresponding Plusquamperfekt would be sie hatten gewonnen, they had won. Sie hatten gewonnen. Got it? So now let's have a look at the irregularities. I already mentioned that all of these tenses have irregular forms, and we can find them in the three forms of irregular verbs. Remember, in the additional material you can find a table with all of these forms, and they consist of the infinitive, the first word, which is for example kommen, to come. This one is not irregular, but it shows you which verb it is. Then we have the second form, in this case kam, came. The Präteritum form, or simple past form, ich kam. And in the Präteritum, we then use this form as our root. So we would conjugate it like this. Ich kam, du kamst, sie es kam, wir kamen, ihr kamt, and sie kamen. And the same goes for all of the other irregular verbs. You just need to look for the second form, and then you use it as your root. The third form that we have is the Partizip 2, in this case gekommen. Gekommen. This is probably the easiest because it doesn't need to be conjugated. You just need to look it up in the table and then you have your Partizip 2. So let's repeat that one more time. If you have an irregular verb in the Präteritum, you just need to look for the second form of the three forms of irregular verbs. And if you have an irregular verb in the perfect or plusquamperfect, you look for the third form, the Partizip 2. Everything else stays the same. The past tenses are probably the hardest part of German. Now let's move on to a more easier part. The only kind of tenses that we now have left are the future tenses or Zukunftsformen in German. Zukunftsformen. Here we have the Futur 1, future 1, Futur 1, and the Futur 2, future 2. The Futur 1 is used in almost all cases and it's the German version of the will future, going to future, and future progressive. The Futur 2, on the other hand, is only used in about 1% of all cases, and it's used to talk about things that will be over at some point in the future. For example, wir werden gesehen haben, we will have seen. You see, this is something that is pretty rarely used. But this shows you how important the Futur 1 is, because we use it in almost 99% of all cases when we talk about the future. The Futur 1 is formed by taking the conjugated version of the verb werden, to become, werden, and then you add the infinitive of the original verb. For example, wir werden sehen, we will see. Wir werden sehen. So it's basically really close to the will future in English with the slight difference that werden needs to be conjugated. So basically in the future all you need is this simple form. Not for like in English. The other one, the Futur 2, is also nice to know, but it's not that important. But to make this a complete course about the tenses, let's look at its formation as well. Unfortunately, the Futur 2 is much more complicated than the Futur 1. It's also formed by taking the conjugated version of the verb werden, to become, but then we don't add the infinitive, we move on with the Partizip 2. Remember, the Partizip 2 is formed by taking the root of the verb and then adding ge at the front and t at the back. But it can also be irregular, and in that case it's the third form of our three forms of irregular verbs. But that's still not it. When we have the Partizip 2, we still have to add sein or haben. Luckily only their infinitive, so we don't need to conjugate them. In most cases we use haben, but if we have a verb that involves some form of movement or action, we use sein. For example, wir werden gesehen haben. We will have seen. Wir werden gesehen haben. Here we have the conjugated version of the verb werden, to become, in this case wir werden, we become. The Partizip 2 of sehen, to see, which is gesehen, seen, gesehen, and then haben, the infinitive of haben, to have. Wir werden gesehen haben. Good. And that's it. Those are all tenses in German. 3 past tenses, 1 present tense, and 2 future tenses. If you made it until this point, then congrats! But your journey doesn't need to be over. What are some possible next steps? That's the topic of our next video. Bis gleich! See you soon! Congratulations! Glückwunsch! You made it to the end of this course. By now you should know the most important aspects of the tenses in German, and you know how to form them and when to use them. But this doesn't need to be the end of your journey. Let's take a look at some possible next steps together, and I will show you how you can further improve your German. First of all, my overall advice for you is to practice as much as you can. And there are multiple ways on how you can do that. One possibility, for example, could be to start a tandem. A tandem is a sort of language exchange with another person, who is ideally a native speaker of German, with whom you can talk in German in a natural conversation. But of course, every other environment that allows you to talk in German is also great. The most important advice here is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are completely normal, especially in the beginning. The more you try and the more you learn, the better your German becomes. Always remember that practice makes perfect. Besides tandems and other sorts of language exchange, another learning method or option that I can definitely recommend are so-called language learning apps. Language learning apps can be a great gamified way to learn a language, especially when it comes to vocabulary. My personal favorites here are the apps Duolingo and Babbel, but there are also many others that are really good. What you could also do to improve your German is read a book in the language. You can either look for a normal German-speaking book or newspaper, or you look for language learning stories. These are short stories or entire books in German that are made especially for learners with a specific language level. So from A1, basic beginner level, to C2, which means native speaker level. Generally speaking, basically everything that makes you surround yourself with German-speaking content is a great idea to improve your German. These can be apps or books, but also German-speaking music, films and TV series. All of these things can help you to improve your German, plus it's fun, so it's easier to stick with it than, for example, to memorize vocabulary lists. And last but not least, my favorite tip: if you already know some basics, the best advice that I can give you is just go out there. Travel to a German-speaking country like Germany, Austria or Switzerland and come into contact with German people, German customs and so on. There is nothing that will give your German so much of a boost than actually going to a German-speaking country. Plus, it's fun and you will see a lot of beautiful landscape and meet incredible people. If you think that you're not ready for that yet, then don't worry. I've got many other courses on how to learn German as well, and I would be really happy to be able to welcome you in one of these as well. This brings us to the end of this course. Thanks again for enrolling and actively participating. And also thank you for your reviews and messages. This really means a lot to me. And if you have any ideas on how I could improve the course, then just write me a message. And you will see that I will change it from time to time and improve the course. That being said, thank you so much for watching this course and also thanks for actively participating. Thank you very much. Vielen Dank. I wish you all the best and I hope to see you in one of my other courses soon. Tschüss, dein Luca.